Frederick Douglass was an American slave that escaped slavery and became an abolitionist, suffragist, author, preacher, editor, and diplomat. He is known as one of the greatest abolitionist speakers of his time. He has been compared to other great speakers such as Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818. The actual date of his birth is unknown, but he chose to celebrate his birthday on February 14th. His birth name is Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was of mixed race and most likely was African, Native American, and European. Sadly, Frederick was separated from his mother at a very young age. This was commonly done in slave states. The plantation owners were a decent family that did not mistreat their slaves. There were no whippings or beatings.
At age 7, he was separated from his grandmother and sold to Way Plantation in Baltimore. When Frederick Douglass was 12 years old, owner Sophia Ault taught him the alphabet. This was very illegal in Maryland. This was an important part in his life because not only did it give him a slight education of reading, it gave him a desire for freedom. Douglass taught himself to read by watching white men and asking children for help. He later taught more than 40 slaves how to read it on a plantation he was loaned to. Once the slave owners found out, he was punished by being sent to a very cruel plantation where he was whipped and beaten daily. Edward Covey was the plantation owner, and he almost broke Douglass' spirit, and when Douglass was 16 years old, he decided to fight back Covey during a beating and won. Covey never tried to beat him again. In 1836, Frederick Douglass met and fell in love with Anna Murray, a free black woman in Baltimore. Anna gave Frederick the drive for freedom to be with her as well as money to help him escape. On September 3, 1838, he boarded a train headed to northern cities and got off near Delaware. Anna told him Delaware was a slave state but not heavily guarded by the borders of bounty hunters, so he could easily cross at night. Their journey took less than 24 hours for him to arrive and meet up with Anna. When they were married, they adopted their surname Douglass, so he would not be easily found by his slave owners, who still considered him property. Anna Frederick had 5 children and spent their lives together until Anna's death in 1882.
While living as a free man, Frederick Douglass became a Methodist minister and very involved in the abolitionist movement. He attended meetings with famous abolitionists such as Harriet Tubman, who started the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass was asked to speak at an anti-slavery rally and did such a great job, he was asked to continue to speak as his stories of slavery to freedom inspired people to join the cause. In 1843, Douglass joined other speakers in the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100 Conventions Project, a 6-month tour at meeting halls throughout the eastern and midwestern United States. While on a tour, he was beaten by non-supporters many times, but still kept speaking to people with the anti-slavery movements.
In 1845, Douglass published a book, The Narrative of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and it became very popular and very quickly spread throughout the country. Douglass' friends wanted him to leave America to go to Europe because they were worried his old slave owner would recognize him and send bounty hunters to bring him back to the plantation. He was still considered property even though he was living as a free man. Frederick Douglass recounts his journey in a passage from his second book, My Bondage and My Freedom, is a quote.
11 days and a half gone, and I have crossed 3,000 miles of the perilous deep. Instead of democratic government, I am under monarchical government. Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft gray fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man.
When in Ireland, Douglass met a man named Daniel O'Connell, who inspired him further to joining the fight to stop slavery throughout the world. Douglass spent the next 2 years in Ireland and Great Britain, where he gave speeches and lectures. His speech drew huge crowds and were described as suffocating because of the number of people. They were so motivational, they put up plaques in recognition of his speech, such as in Alexander Fletcher's Finsbury Chapel in May of 1846. Douglass stated in England he wasn't treated as a color, but as a man, and this inspired him to return to America to fight for all black men to be free. In 1846, with the help of Thomas Clarkson, British abolitionist, and from the money earned from his book sales, Frederick Douglass was able to negotiate a price for his freedom from Thomas Auld, his owner. Douglass returned to America as truly a free man. Today, there are multiple plaques in cities of Cork and Waterford, Ireland, celebrating Frederick Douglass's many heartfelt speeches. When Douglass came back to America, he published his first newspaper against slavery. It was called the North Star and was in Rochester, New York. The North Star opposed the American Colonization Society, who wanted to send blacks back to Africa. He later partnered up with a man named William Lloyd Garrison. They made anti-slavery newspapers. Douglass later split with Garrison as he found him too radical, as Garrison often burned the Constitution to express his opinion as he felt it was pro-slavery. Douglass disagreed. He thought the Constitution could help anti-slavery movement.
Douglass believed in rights for all people, as he was the only black man to attend the Seneca Falls Convention on women's suffrage. He is quoted on his speech,
"In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world."
and this changed the minds of the delegates in supporting women's rights. So, after the Civil War ended, the debates about the 15th Amendment were happening. Women suffrage activists wanted the word women added to the statement that gave free men and free black men the right to vote. While Douglass agreed women should be added, it was too risky at the time and could cause the 15th Amendment to be thrown out completely. He was not willing to take that chance.
Frederick Douglass was the first desegregationist in 1850. He fought for African American children to have the same rights for education as other children. Douglass called for court action to open all schools for all children. No more need for black schools only. Douglass met a black man named John Brown, who was a radical political abolitionist who planned to start an armed slave rebellion in the South. Douglass disapproved of Brown's idea to raid the Federal Armory, but was unable to stop the raid at Harper's Ferry, so Douglass fled to Canada, worried that his association with Brown would enrage the American public and get him killed. Years later, he returned and talked it out with Andrew Hunter, the prosecutor for John Brown.
During the Civil War, Douglass served as a recruiter for the Union Army in Massachusetts. He thought that the African Americans should be allowed to engage in the fight for their freedom. If these African Americans were fighting in the Civil War, they should also get the right to vote. Due to Douglas's prominence during the war, he was awarded several appointments after the war. Among them was serving as the president of the Freedom's Band Savings Bank. Near the end of his life, Douglass regularly made speeches about voting rights and desegregation. He opposed movements that sought to create all-black towns in Kansas and to move black people to Africa. Frederick Douglass died in his home on February 20th, 1895 at age 77.